All right, welcome back, everybody. We've been together for about 15 weeks. This is week 15. It's kind of hard to believe that the end of the semester is approaching. Up until this point, we've spent a lot of our time talking about public speaking, as we should be in this class, but I want to spend today talking about a little bit more than public speaking. You probably don't know a whole lot about the history of the communication discipline, so we're going to spend a little bit of today getting to know that history a little bit better. I'm going to talk to you about that history because speech plays a big role in that history, but speech isn't all that communication has to offer. So we're going to look at communication as it's developed as a discipline, as it's developed historically, and talk about some of the things that led to the development of the communication discipline so you have a better sense of that. Part of why I'm doing this is because I get a little bit frustrated with a lot of the ways that the basic course in communication is often taught. In fact, I don't even like the term basic course because basic implies that it's easy, and a lot of you probably have seen that communication itself and public speaking specifically is pretty challenging. Part of what I'm up against when I teach a course like this are two things here. One is that we talked about on the first day that a lot of people don't really like taking public speaking. I recognize that. I asked you on the first day of class, at least if you watched the welcome video, why you all were here, and a lot of you probably are here because it's required, and I get that. So I have this quotation that I talked about from Jerry Seinfeld about how people's biggest fear is actually public speaking. They fear public speaking more than they fear death. A lot of people don't really like giving public speeches, and they don't really like taking public speaking. And for a lot of students, that's where communication starts and ends at the university level. A lot of you will take public speaking because it's a required course, and you won't take other classes at the university. I think that's a sad thing, so I'm hoping that I can talk to you a little bit about what the discipline of communication has to offer so that you at least walk away from this class knowing what else communication is, because a lot of it is not about public speaking anymore. The second thing that I'm often up against is this perception that communication is easy and that it's kind of a major for slackers. I'll tell you that when I was an undergrad, I took all my gen eds. I took physics, I took calculus, I took chemistry, I took biology, I took math, I took lots of different classes, and my communication classes were actually a lot of times the hardest classes that I took. Most of them ended with me writing a 15 or 20 page paper at the end of the semester. Most of them were evaluated based on critical thinking skills and argumentation. Very rarely was I able to just put work off for those classes because they were hard, and they often required me to use skills that were hard to come by. Oftentimes I didn't have sample papers or speeches to work from, and I just had to really listen, take good notes, do my research, really think about what I was talking about, and go from there. So I want you to get out of this mindset that all of communication is what public speaking is, because a lot of what we do in this field is much broader than that. Public speaking, like I said, plays a big part in that history, but really there's a lot more to the discipline of communication that's on offer, and if you understand the connections between public speaking and the rest of the discipline, even if you're not going to become communication majors, and I don't think it's my job here to recruit you to be communication majors, I want you to know what communication is about. Obviously, if some of you decide to become communication majors, I'd be very happy with that. And if any of you want to talk to me at the end of class or at the end of the semester about what that might look like for you and what career options you might have, I'm happy to do that. But that's not my primary purpose here today. Now, I'll tell you that the history of speech is where we're going to spend a lot of our time this week. Next week, we're going to spend some time talking about the future of speech. But I'll tell you that I've taken some graduate seminars talking about the history of public speaking and the history of rhetoric. And over time, we could map out the interest in rhetoric, the idea of how much rhetoric is a worthy field of study. There are lots of people who've said that public speaking isn't really this worthy field of study. When we talked about your techne speeches a few weeks ago, I talked to you about how Plato was even the person who coined the term rhetoric, didn't think that rhetoric was a term worthy of study. He didn't think that it was a techne. And from there, rhetoricians have gone in and out of fashion. There have been times when people have been really excited about rhetoric. There have been times when people said rhetoric is useless. It's just mere rhetoric. It's just people pandering. It's not really a beneficial field of study. And so over the last 2,500 years, you can see it kind of wax and wane, and different people declaring it dead and then reviving it. Oftentimes, great interest in rhetoric reappears in moments of political crisis. When we have wars or when we have leaders that we don't particularly like, a lot of people will turn back to speech and will try to understand speech's relation to politics. And will try to use public speaking and to recover the lost arts of public speaking that led public discourse to go astray. So we can map this out over time and talk about historically how interested people have been in rhetoric, a lot of people will take the 5 canons and will say, yeah, those are all worthy of study, and then other people will come back and say, well, rhetoric's really only about style, or it's really only about delivery. We're going to collapse rhetoric. We're going to shut it down. It doesn't really do us much good to talk about it. We have other fields like philosophy or sociology or political science or business that are more important than public speaking. And I think that's a mistake because, like I said, a lot of times rhetoric will creep back up once the other disciplines have crisis moments. And so a lot of people will try to do away with rhetoric when other disciplines are doing well, and they'll come back to it when the other disciplines are not doing particularly well. Now let's talk about speech a little bit in the 20th century. I'm curious if you could pinpoint when communication became a discipline. Go ahead and shout out some times of when you think at American universities either speech or communication became its own department within the university. Just go ahead and shout out some answers, what you think. What? 1960s? Would anyone go earlier than that? 1920s? 1970s? Would anyone say maybe it goes back to the 17 or 1800s? A couple people. There is actually a definitive answer to this question. The definitive answer to this question is 1914, which is actually pretty late in the context of a lot of American universities. The field of communication has only been around for about 100 years. At a lot of places, they still say that communication isn't a field that we should go about studying. So if you were going to go to an Ivy League institution like Yale or Harvard, you would not find a communication department there. You wouldn't find rhetoric there. There's a rhetoric chair of public speaking at either Yale or Harvard. I always forget which one, and it's occupied by someone who doesn't study rhetoric. Part of the reason for that is because rhetoric developed as a field to try and be more of a public field, and a lot of the Ivy League universities are private. So what happened is actually up until 1914, everybody who studied speech at the university, but they didn't have their own department. They were always in an English department up until that point. And so they were studying with people who were studying classic literature. There were people who were studying writing and composition. There were lots of people in English departments, and public speaking teachers, for the most part, if they were in English departments at all, were kind of on the margins of that. We have this history we've talked a lot about here. You guys have probably counted the number of times that I've gone back to Aristotle's rhetoric in this class as one of our origin points for public speaking. Aristotle has another work that he called the Poetics, and most of the English tradition as it exists today and as it's existed historically comes out of that Poetics tradition that looks at classic works of literature, looks at composition, and kind of people have historically treated these separately as genres of fiction and nonfiction. So rhetoricians were mostly in the realm of nonfiction, and everybody else in English departments were in the realm of fiction. What happened is in 1914, there were a lot of public speaking instructors who were tired of being on the fringe of these English departments. They were getting kind of annoyed that they were being treated like second-class citizens. And there was an organization called the National Council of Teachers of English. That organization still exists. If you're an English major today, chances are you will be familiar with the National Council of Teachers of English. They had their annual convention, and a bunch of public speaking instructors decided, we're tired of being treated like garbage. They actually walked out of the meeting of the National Council of Teachers of English because they were so mad that they weren't being taken seriously, and they decided to form their own organization called the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking. That organization has existed since 1914. We'll talk about how it's evolved over time, but ultimately they had to make an argument that speech was a techne, speech was a major or a field of study that was worth our time, and that it was good for undergraduate students to become educated in speech. A lot of how they made that argument was talking about how the climate of the universities had historically been changing. In the 1800s, we had the Morrill Act, which got the land-grant institutions. These were some of the first public universities. We're not a land-grant school, but NDSU is for North Dakota, and each state has a land-grant university. A lot of land-grant universities adapted public speaking because of the communities that they were serving. The people at the Ivy Leagues still had their canons of great English literature. They had their Shakespeare, they had their Chaucer, they had whoever else you might have read in AP Lit. But essentially they decided, we don't really care, people probably learn public speaking already, or if they don't learn it, they'll just pick it up in other ways. But the public universities took a different approach, and they said a lot of our students are actually coming from places where up until this point, if they've had public speaking instruction at all, it hasn't been very good, and a lot of people haven't had it in the first place. And a lot of the idea behind the land-grant institutions or other public universities was to educate large masses of students and not, rooms of 10 or 20 like you might see at some liberal arts colleges, but instead to give everyone a chance at an education and at a fairly cheap rate for that education. And so public speaking was seen as a public good that was designed to help you all become more successful in your careers and also to help our civic life, to help you all have a voice in politics. And that's how these people made their case for why public speaking was necessary. And so even to this day, the origins of speech at the university have political consequences that are really interesting and worthy of study. Now, a lot of these people had been spending their time studying public speaking, and they looked for a place to start. They said, if we're going to be our own discipline, if we're going to have our own journals and our own conferences and our own classes to teach and our own research, we probably need to figure out what it is that we do and how we're different from English or sociology or politics or law. How do we distinguish ourselves? And so what happened is from 1914 up until about the 1960s, a lot of people who studied and taught speech were kind of making things up as they went along. And they figured, okay, if we're going to study speech, we might as well study good examples from throughout history. Earlier in the semester, I believe when we talked about comm ethics, I talked to you about Cato the Elder's presumption that the ideal orator, the ideal public speaker, is a good person, and in his time usually a good man, speaking well. Well, that's a lot of what public speaking instruction looked like for the next 40 or 50 years after the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking was founded. They would spend their time studying big speeches by big figures, and so they'd look at George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Lincoln or Roosevelt, and they would try to figure out what are these speeches that these people are giving. Are they good speeches, and if so, what makes them good speeches? And so they had these classic examples, usually from US presidents, and they would try to talk about the merits of those speeches. They would try to figure out what made these people good men and what made them able to speak well. You can probably imagine that this got a little bit old after a while, but that's kind of where the discipline started. They were looking for really good examples, and they were sharing those examples with their students. They were trying to get their students to speak like these people. They were trying to do speech criticism and analyze what made their speeches effective. So it started out pretty fine, but after a while, a lot of those instructors decided that what they were doing really wasn't up to the task of what an academic field should be doing. And so there were a couple of critiques that developed. One of those critiques is that a lot of the speeches that people were studying in speech departments were about old dead white guys. Usually they were about dead US presidents. Occasionally they were about living US presidents. Kenneth Burke, who I've mentioned here and before, had a piece that was really interesting about Hitler and Hitler's Mein Kampf. And so they were trying to study what made people's rhetoric effective, what made a good person, what made speaking well. A lot of that was looking at old dead white guys, and eventually there were women and people of color, like one of my mentors, who got into the field, and ultimately they said, we know that there are examples from history of famous women or famous people of color who have made some really powerful speeches. And so I've got Sappho and Martin Luther King here. We have to figure out, okay, the old dead white guy tradition is probably speeches mostly for white audiences and usually mostly for living white guy audiences. What they wanted to recover is, okay, what are some of the historical traditions that have been missing when you only focus on old dead white guys? And what gets added to the tradition when we look at the diversity of the rhetorical tradition, either historically or in our contemporary moment? So one of the big critiques was that we were spending all this time talking about a very limited subset of the population. Usually the only people who were able to speak in ancient Greece or ancient Rome were these old white guys who had a lot of power and a lot of wealth and a lot of money and a lot of influence. So we're looking at these speeches, we're trying to make sense of them. And part of what's going on at this time is that up until about the 1950s, politics in America looked pretty civil. You all might remember when we talked about civic and community engagement, and I put up a Venn diagram of civic versus civil. In the 1960s, we're starting to see a whole bunch of civil unrest. The 1960s was a very powerful decade. A lot of people were protesting. A lot of people were not engaging in the traditional channels of voting or journalism. They were out in the streets, right? They were protesting. There was first wave feminism or second wave feminism. Lots of people protesting the Vietnam War, lots of people protesting for civil rights. And if we look to the historical examples of what constitutes a good speech, and those examples are coming from Aristotle or Cicero or Quintilian, they're not really equipped to describe what's happening in the world around us. And so a lot of professors were trying to teach those classical models from the last 2,500 years, and their students were like, yeah, but that doesn't explain what's happening with Malcolm X. How do I make sense of this current moment? And so they had to change their theories and expand their theories to account for people who weren't historically included in the tradition, but also for methods like protest, like assembly, that were not included in that tradition, things that we traditionally thought of as uncivil. How do we understand an act like looting as an expression of speech? How do we understand violence or burning of draft cards as an act of speech? That's a lot of what was going on in the 1960s. Another big critique that happened is that there was a proliferation of media. And so a lot of people in speech departments had historically been studying speeches, but that's not really where they wanted to keep their attention. A lot of the public's attention was shifting away from the public address. Yes, people still listen to Eisenhower and Kennedy and Nixon speak. They still, for the most part, were a centralized audience. But if you think of FDR's fireside chats, a lot of people were listening to speeches over the radio. A lot of people saw fictional speeches happening in television or in movies. And are measures for determining what constitutes a good speech the same for a movie or a television show or for music? They started adapting, and they started realizing that a lot of the tools that we've had for public speaking, things like the rhetorical situation, the communication model, the canons, all of the things we've been talking about all semester, are actually really useful tools for studying culture and studying things that are not speeches. And so a lot of speech expanded in the 1950s and 60s to look at more genres besides just one person speaking to a large audience. There's a third critique that starts to happen, and it goes back to what I said about Cato's good person speaking well kind of mentality. In 1965, a lot of people were still studying old dead white guys, mostly presidents, and Ed Black from the University of Wisconsin came along. He published a book called Rhetorical Criticism. And in his book, Rhetorical Criticism, Black is a little concerned that there's so much emphasis on this good person speaking well kind of mentality. And what he's concerned about specifically is that almost every research study that he sees, almost every analysis that he sees of public speaking talks about the speaker's intent and how good that person was, or it talks about the effect that it had, the fact that they were able to speak well, or the fact that they were able to move an audience. And what happens is Ed Black starts studying speeches that don't really fit well into either category. We have he talks specifically about a figure named John J. Chapman, who was fighting for abolition of slavery. And Chapman gave this speech in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour from Philadelphia. He gives a speech in a barn. It's way ahead of its time in terms of race relations, in terms of slavery. It's this very powerful speech that he delivers in a barn to a very small audience. And so it's a really interesting speech, but it has probably good intentions, but it doesn't necessarily have the best effect. Nobody really hears this speech other than the people in his immediate audience. Black discovers a copy of it, but essentially the speech didn't have any effect, and so slavery wouldn't become a thing until later on, or slavery wouldn't become abolished until later on. Part of the problem with studying John J. Chapman's Coatesville address also is the fact that later in life, Chapman, who had fought very hard for abolition, actually became a white supremacist. And so how can we actually measure his intent? It gets a little bit tricky. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen Dead Poet Society, but I would imagine that if Ed Black were teaching a rhetorical criticism class, it would look a lot like this scene. So I'm going to use fiction as a rhetorical device to help you think of how nonfiction speeches were taught around this time and help you understand why Black might have been really frustrated with the way that people were studying and teaching and researching speech.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Ms. Perry, please read the opening paragraph of the preface, entitled Understanding Poetry.
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, carefully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And 2, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excellent. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. It's not like pipe. We're talking about poetry. How could you describe poetry like American Bandstand? I like Byron, I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it. Now I want you to rip out that page. Rip out the entire page. You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out. Come on, rip it out. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, not just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip. Be gone, J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. Rip. Shred the tear. Rip it out. I want to hear nothing but ripping of Mr. Pritchard. We're separated. Put it on a roll.
That's probably how Ed Black would have treated a graduate seminar in his time. A lot of the people that he was working with would try to be like J. Evans Pritchard and would try to map out a speech's greatness by trying to figure out its perfection and its importance. Black is not having any of that. He would likely say to his graduate students to rip out their pages of their textbook if that's what was the case. Now, why might it be a problem? Why might it be difficult to measure intent and effect? Why might Black be really annoyed by this? What would be the problem of measuring a speech's greatness only on how perfect its style is or the importance that it has? Okay, so speech is more about delivering a message. Can you say more about that? That's a good start. Okay, so I think what you're getting at is that speakers have what they try to project of a message, and audiences have what they receive as part of a message, but those don't always match up. Sometimes I have really good intentions and it just falls totally flat. Sometimes I have really bad intentions, but you're still moved by them, and it's kind of hard to predict where in between the speaker and the audience a speech is great, because it's got two moving parts that are pretty solid. Are there other reasons why this might be a problem? I'm curious how you'd go about measuring a speech's perfection or a speech's importance. If you had to design a study that would measure a speech's perfection, how would you measure that? How do you know if a speech by, I don't know, Angela Grimke is more perfect than a speech by Thomas Jefferson? Yeah, a lot of our evaluation of speech, a lot of our speech criticism, we try very hard to get it to be something replicable, but oftentimes speech itself is more of an art than a science. It's subjective, as you said. And so if I'm going to decide what constitutes a perfect speech, I might have criteria that I'm using for speech criticism and trying to make sense of it. But those criteria might not be the same criteria that somebody else would use. And maybe we disagree on how perfect a speech is. So it's kind of hard to measure what makes a good speech? Is it that it's written in an iambic pentameter? Because Shakespeare would score very high on that, but Charles Dickens would not, right? Is it about the use of figures of speech? Is it about metaphors? Is it about delivery? How do you measure a speech's perfection? It's really hard to do. More importantly, how do you measure a speech's importance? How do you know when a speech is important? Can we know whether a speech is important? It's probably situation dependent. That's a very Bitzer kind of mentality, right? It depends on what we're using to measure a speech's importance. Is the importance about the topic? Is it about the speaker? Is it about the occasion? Is it about the effect that it has on the audience? If FDR tells you not to pull all of your money out of the banks and then you don't pull all of your money out of the banks, is it an effective speech? We can probably say yes. But ultimately, what this is about is that it's really hard to know a speaker's intent because people's intent can change over time. It's also really hard to know whether a speech has an effect. Sometimes we can see immediate effects, and we like to attribute that to speech, but sometimes it might be less attributable to the speech itself and more to the context. If we're afraid of nuclear war and JFK gives a speech about the Cuban Missile Crisis, we might respond not so much because of what JFK said, but because of our fear of nuclear war. We also might have effects that happen over time. You might remember when I pulled up social judgment theory and had that whole continuum from, yes, I'll marry you, to I have pepper spray and I know how to use it. Most people don't change their minds very quickly, but they might be inclined to change their minds over time. And so it's really hard to measure a speech's greatness. I've taken calculus, and this is one way you could try to make speech a little bit more objective, or at least a little bit less subjective. But if your measures on your x-axis and your measures on your y-axis are still kind of subjective, it becomes tricky to know what a speech's intent and effect are. And that's going to take us into our participation question. So you can go ahead and take out a sheet of paper, go ahead and put your name, your lab instructor's name, your section number, and your answer to this question. Our question today is going to be a little trickier than usual. You don't necessarily have to worry about getting the right or wrong answer, but it's designed to help you think of what kinds of questions you might see on your final exam, because the end of the semester is approaching, and your final exam will be comprehensive. And so some of you might struggle with this question. But ultimately, the question is, in his critique of intent and effect, which communication theory was Ed Black most concerned about? Was he most concerned about the 5 canons, the communication model, the rhetorical situation, or the pistes or modes of proof known as ethos, pathos, and logos? When he's trying to say that speech writers or speech critics shouldn't necessarily worry all the time about intent and effect because there's greatness beyond a good person speaking well, which theory is he most likely concerned about? There's no penalty for guessing wrong, but if this is a tricky question for you, you'll probably want to do a little bit of reviewing before your final. Does anybody need more time? All right, let's do some hand raising then. Raise your hand if you think it's the 5 canons. Nobody? Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's the communication model. Nobody again? Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's the rhetorical situation. Quite a lot of you. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's about the pistes, ethos, pathos, and logos. A handful of you. Okay. Somebody be brave and tell me why you chose the answer that you did. Again, I'm not going to make you feel bad for guessing wrong. There might be multiple ways you could spin this question, but ultimately there's a best answer here. This is probably a harder question than what you'd see on your final. But somebody be brave and tell me why you chose the answer that you chose. Yeah. Rhetorical criticism? Yeah, okay. So Ed Black's book in 1965 was called Rhetorical Criticism. I will tell you that Lloyd Bitzer's theory of the rhetorical situation came out 3 years later in 1968. So Black didn't yet have the theory to talk about the rhetorical situation. There is a case that probably could be made. After all, Bitzer talks about exigence, audience, and constraints. So he talks about trying to evaluate the situation that you're in and how you would respond to a public problem, who's in your audience and how they might react to that problem. I could maybe see a case for that, but there's a better answer here, and that's okay. I appreciate the bravery for guessing. Anybody else want to try here? Maybe we're just guessing and we got a 1 in 4 chance? I'll tell you that there's a much better answer to that question, and that answer to that question is the communication model. It's been a while since we've looked at this, and only a handful of you raised your hands for this, so I'm going to encourage you to review, because this is something we've talked about a few times this semester, but we haven't touched on it much in a few weeks. If you're looking at the communication model, ultimately what we're looking at is that middle relationship, source, message, channel, and receiver. The source is trying to get a message across, like one of your classmates wisely said. The source is trying to get that message across in the best way possible to the receiver. Ultimately, what's challenging about intent and effect is that we have a source and we have a receiver, and they're two different people. And as my master's thesis advisor used to say, human behavior is infinitely variable. So the source is trying to get an idea across. They might have very good intentions with a message. You all probably wrote papers or talked about this in your lab sections earlier this semester about how miscommunication often happens when the receiver doesn't get the message that the source intended. So the source might have really good intentions, but if the source is John J. Chapman and the receiver is only 3 people in a barn in Pennsylvania, then chances are it's not going to have much of an effect, and so we might say it's not a very good speech, despite the fact that his intentions might have been ahead of their time. Ultimately, also, the receiver end of things is concerned with effect. The receiver is trying to figure out what to do with this message, and if they want to change their attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, right, their values, then we could say it has an effect on the audience. But there's lots of things that can get in the way that are not just intent and effect. And so ultimately what we're dealing with here is the context is really complicated. And what Ed Black is trying to say is there can still be good speeches that may not have the best intentions but are still good speeches, or might not have much of an effect on their receivers but nevertheless are still good speeches. I want you to think through what would constitute a good speech in either one of those situations, because a lot of us still like that Cato the Elder kind of mentality of a person with good intentions, a good person or a good man in his time, speaking well and having an effect upon his or her audience. So that's ultimately what we're dealing with here. If that's been tricky for you, you'll probably want to go back and review some of the theory that we've talked about in here. I've given you a lot of history and theory in lecture. In lab, you've taken a lot of that history and theory and tried to put it into practice. Ultimately, what I hope is that those two things will come together, and after you leave this class, you're still going to be giving speeches for the rest of your life, and hopefully you'll have a good foundation in the history and theory of public speaking, and also lots of practice for you to apply it. Now let's go back to Ed Black talking about intent and effect. For about 50 or 55 years since rhetorical criticism was published, a lot of people have said you can't really talk about intent and you can't really talk about effect. If you're talking about a speech, or if you're talking about a television show, a social movement, whatever it happens to be, you can't really talk about intent because you can't always know what a speaker is thinking and whether they mean well or whether they don't mean well. And you can't always talk about effect because effect is sometimes hard to measure, and sometimes effect isn't always good. Remember, these people started their organization in the 1910s, right, in 1914. They were writing up until 1965, and over the course of that time, they were concerned about Hitler, right? In the 1930s and 40s, a lot of rhetorical critics and a lot of philosophers were very concerned that this person, who most people in the West said did not have good intent, was having a lot of effect on people in Germany and elsewhere. And so part of what comes from studying speech is trying to figure out how do we talk about it. If we have ways of talking about it that are no longer applicable, if we can't know a person's intent, or if that effect doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, then we can't really talk about it. And so what happened as a result of Ed Black publishing this book was a movement that arose in rhetorical studies called close textual analysis. And this movement basically did away with intent and effect, and for the most part, if we go back to the last slide, context, and ultimately focused on the rhetorical artistry of the speech itself, mostly through style. And so close critics would look very closely and they'd go word by word through the Declaration of Independence and talk about its stylistic artistry and talk about how magical it was and why this document had so much power, without talking about the intent of the framers of the Declaration of Independence, without talking about the effects of the Declaration of Independence, but really just looking at the text and its dynamics itself. So a lot of people in rhetorical studies for the last 50 years have said you can't talk about intent and you can't talk about effect. And I remember being in graduate school and one of my professors said to us, okay, but if we're going to do that, if we're going to say that we can't talk about intent and effect, and historically those have been two of the biggest things that rhetoricians have been able to talk about and explain why studying speech matters, it's kind of like if you have a dog. And you have this dog and it's this cute little dog and you decide, okay, I can't talk about intent, I can't talk about effect, so I'm going to chop off the dog's head and I'm going to chop off the dog's tail. Sorry for those of you who that's a very violent metaphor or violent image for. He asks us, what are you left with if you chop off the dog's head and the dog's tail? And a lot of us said, well, you're kind of stuck with the worst parts of the dog. There's not a whole lot of invention that you can do there. There's not a whole lot of meaningful speech criticism that you can do. So a lot of people have declared the study of intent and the study of effect dead. But even in the last 3 years, they've kind of resurrected the study of at least effect. And I would imagine that in the next couple of years, we'll see a resurrection of intent. There's a book that came out 3 years ago called The Effects of Rhetoric and the Rhetoric of Effects by Amos Kive and Davis Hauck. And they basically talk about how rhetoricians, even though they don't like the word effect and all of the baggage that it has coming from Ed Black, we still sometimes like to think about speeches as having influence over their audience. And so we might not use the word effect, but we might use words like influence or reception studies and talk about how people have reacted to speeches that they've heard or other texts that they've encountered. Now, ultimately, what happened, I told you earlier that one of the expansions that came in the 1960s, again, very powerful decade, was that a lot of people stopped studying speeches as the only object of study, and they decided instead that they were going to study communication more broadly. So I mentioned radio, television, film. We could probably throw in theater. We could probably pull in social movements. There were a lot of things that people were studying that were beyond just public speaking. The organization that was founded in 1914 was the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking. But around the 60s, around the 70s, people were saying we're studying things that aren't public speaking anymore. We're studying speech, but we're also studying communication more broadly. There was a rise of social science that started looking at small group communication. They started looking at persuasion and propaganda from a social science perspective and tried to figure out how those things worked. There were people studying journalism and mass media. There were lots of people studying a lot of different things. And so eventually, the Speech Communication Association morphed into the National Communication Association. And that's the organization that I'm still a part of that still exists today, about 104 years later. Now, I bring this to your attention because I want you to, again, understand that there's more to communication than just speech. If you happen to look at the National Communication Association's website, what's really interesting about communication across the country is that that organization has, as of right now, 48 different divisions. Some of these, only one of these that I can really think of is speech or public address, and that's the public address division. So there's one division here that talks about public speaking still, but you can see that public speaking has developed into a whole bunch of different things: activism and social justice, Asian and Pacific communication. There's a division devoted specifically to the basic course and studying public speaking. There's all kinds of different mass communication, peace and conflict communication, performance studies, philosophy, rhetorical and communication theory, spiritual communication. There are 48 different divisions of this organization. And what's most interesting about that is that most of those people in those organizations don't really know what the other organizations do. So up until I came to the University of North Dakota, I'm trained as a rhetorician. I've spent a lot of my time studying speech and other cultural artifacts from a humanistic perspective. I have colleagues here who do advertising, who do PR, who do marketing and journalism. I don't do any of that. Up until this time, I've spent 10 years in school and have not encountered people who did that kind of work. The main thing that still unites these 48 different divisions of communication is the fact that they call themselves communication, and they're usually in communication departments across the United States. The other main thing that unites them is a lot of them study how people use human communication to either unite and come together, or how we use communication to divide ourselves up. And so what happened is since 1914, speech has become much more than just speech. Communication has lots of different things to offer, and even what we offer here is very different from what they might offer at the University of Minnesota or Iowa or Wisconsin. The other thing that's happened as a result of this division happening within the field is that there are 48 different divisions, and every 10 years or so, the organization has these panic moments where they say, we're getting too big. I don't understand what those rhetoricians are doing over there. I don't understand why these people are studying aging in communication over there. I don't understand what these other people do, and so how can we call ourselves a discipline if there are 48 different divisions among us and we don't really understand each other's work? But what often happens as a result after that is somebody will publish an article in one of the top journals in communication saying, we're getting too divided and we need to figure out who we are. And then people say, yeah, we need to centralize. And then as soon as somebody says we need to centralize, they go back to the list of 48 different divisions and they say, okay, who are we going to cut? And it turns out that the different divisions of communication all serve very different purposes. A lot of them are very useful, and our knowledge and discovery of communication would be cut short if we had any fewer than 48 different divisions. And so the question becomes, is this umbrella of communication studies strong enough to hold all of these different people who study very, very different things? Again, one of the main messages I want you to take away from today is that there's lots of courses, there's lots of ideas in communication that do much more than just public speaking. A lot of you will probably finish this class and it'll be your only exposure to communication studies. I think that's a mistake. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what to expect in the field of communication. So I'll tell you that I told you that CivComm is probably my favorite lesson in this class. Civic and community engagement was what really got me excited. How do people use communication to deliberate with one another? So some of my divisions are free expression, public address, public dialogue, and deliberation, right? I have lots of different divisions that are all closely related to civic and community engagement. There are some new divisions that are developing that might interest some of you. One of the ones that I find most interesting is communication and sport. We have a couple graduate students here who are working on doing that. Some of you might be interested in international or intercultural communication. Some of you might be interested in PR or advertising or mass communication. There are lots of different faculty members who study those things, and if you want to learn more about any of those things, I may not be the best person for you to reach out to, but if you reach out to me, I know who in the field to put you in touch with so that you can study those things. Now, beyond that, there's lots of different subject areas. I want you to go ahead and take a look at the curriculum in the Department of Communication. I mentioned that I'm trained as a rhetorician. I'm trained in the humanities. A lot of my colleagues do things like strategic communication, advertising, public relations, journalism, media studies, digital communication, social media. There's lots of different classes that you might take at UND. And again, my job here is not necessarily to recruit you to take those classes or to major in communication, just to have a better sense of what's available to you. If any of you are interested in advertising or public relations, we have a couple clubs and organizations on campus that you can join. And ultimately, there are, what might be most of interest to a lot of you is internships and careers. A lot of our graduates, and some of them have been communication majors, some of them have not, have used our field of communication to try and get jobs and internships. And so they've worked with local radio stations or local marketing firms, or they've worked with local newspapers. We have ways to get you out there so that you can start getting some of those jobs and internships that'll set you up for the kind of career that you want. My main reason for sharing all of this is so that you can get a deeper understanding and appreciation for what public speaking and communication have to offer in the 21st century. And so next week, we've talked this week a lot about the past of public speaking and communication. Next week, we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about the future of public speaking and communication. And I'm going to ask you to think over the next week or so about what you would like to see as the future of either of those things, either the public speaking or communication. And you can think about the future of those things specifically at the University of North Dakota, or you can think about those things in the field at large and what the discipline of communication might have to offer. What are some trends that you'd like to see? Where do you think it might be going? So I'll leave you with that today. You can all turn in your participation questions here, and I'll see you next week.